The World this weekend. This is Sean Lay. Hello. 6 Britons believed dead, the hostage survivors on their way home. What now for the region they've left behind and the fight against extremists operating in the Sahara? America's former top defence official in Africa tells this programme the Obama administration abandoned confrontation for containment and must now change course again.
I think for success, it would be very beneficial to have U.S. troops on the ground, special forces, mentoring the African forces.
Here, snow is causing more problems for many air and rail travellers. We'll bring you the latest on the weather. And Barack Obama takes the oath of office this afternoon, beginning his second term as U.S. president.
Time is surprisingly short for a man with a 4-year term ahead of him. And still Washington wonders about the man himself. Quite what Barack Obama stands for is still something of a mystery.
Our Washington correspondent Johnny Diamond will be unravelling that. The BBC News is read by Susan Ray.
3 Britons have died and 3 are feared to have been killed in the 4-day hostage crisis in Algeria. A UK resident is also believed to have died. Islamic militants seized scores of hostages at a remote gas plant in the desert on Wednesday. Algerian special forces mounted a final offensive yesterday to end the siege. This morning, David Cameron sent his condolences to the families who he said had had a dreadful ordeal. He said the blame for the loss of life lay squarely with the terrorists. Here's our World Affairs correspondent, Emily Buchanan.
David Cameron said the hostage crisis was a stark reminder of the growing threat from terrorism, particularly in North Africa. He and other Western leaders are all standing firmly behind Algeria's handling of the crisis. The French foreign minister said the authorities there had faced an intolerable situation. As more information emerges about the hostage drama, the Algerian government has warned that the number of dead may rise. The Algerian security forces are still scouring the gas plant for booby traps, and there are reports they've discovered 25 bodies, people allegedly killed by the militants. The Algerian security service is also being reported as saying that the mastermind behind the kidnap, Mokhtar Belmokhtar, had planted his agents on short-term contracts with BP. They worked as drivers, cooks and guards. This hasn't been confirmed, but if true, will raise many questions about the future security of all the country's energy facilities.
The Foreign Secretary, William Hague, said 22 Britons who survived the attack in Algeria were all now back in the UK. He said the last returned overnight and were being reunited with their families. More details from our correspondent, Andy Moore.
After days of uncertainty about their fate, Mr Hague said all the citizens from Britain had now been accounted for. The dead have not been named. There's no official list of those who survived the attack, but some of the names are beginning to emerge. The wife of a Lincolnshire engineer, Lou Fear, told the BBC this morning that her husband had been through a horrendous ordeal. The family of Alan MacLeod, originally from Plymouth, said they were relieved he was now safe. One Algerian worker told how a British colleague had been forced at gunpoint to call out to his hiding friends. Shortly after he did so, he was shot. When asked if some of the hostages had been executed, Mr Hague said that was quite likely.
Prayers are being said today for 4 climbers who died in an avalanche at Glencoe in the Highlands. A woman who was badly injured is in a serious condition in hospital. The cold weather and further snowfalls are causing more problems for travellers. There are delays on some train services and up to 250 flights are being cancelled at Heathrow. Here's Richard Slee.
Passengers at Heathrow Airport face the most disruption today, with about 20% of flights cancelled. But at Gatwick and Stansted airports, managers say they're operating a normal service, with teams on standby to clear snow if it starts to settle on the runways. Eurostar has cancelled 4 trains and says other services will be delayed by up to an hour due to speed restrictions. Many other train operators are running an amended timetable and say passengers should check at their local station for any changes before they start their journey. As more snow falls on already icy roads, drivers are being urged to take more care and to allow more time for their journey. But there are no reported delays at the ferry terminals.
The BBC has apologised after it broadcast a repeat of a children's television programme with a character dressed as Jimmy Savile. The episode of The Tweenies, which was filmed in 2001, was shown on the CBeebies channel this morning. The character, Max, appeared in a blonde wig, wearing Savile's trademark tracksuits and using his accent and catchphrases. The The BBC said it was very sorry for any offence caused. The programme would not be repeated. Earlier this month, police called Saville a predatory sex offender who abused more than 200 people.
Susan Ray. If there's one positive thing to have emerged from the horror of the Algerian hostage-taking, it's the attention it has focused on a part of Africa where lawlessness has been a way of life for centuries and where extremist groups have quietly flourished for years. This morning, David Cameron said the world now needs to act to ensure that the insecurity in that part of Africa is finally addressed.
This is a stark reminder, once again, of the threat we face from terrorism the world over. We have had successes in recent years in reducing the threat from some parts of the world, but the threat has grown, particularly in North Africa. This is a global threat, and it will require a global response.
The Foreign Secretary, William Hague, told the BBC the British government had wanted to get involved in the hostage rescue mission earlier.
Of course, we would have liked to have been consulted, but they decided as a sovereign country that this was something on their soil that they would deal with and that they needed to deal with urgently.
Well, many of the British hostages are still on their way home. We've yet to hear about the experiences they've gone through directly. But one relative has expressed the frustration of recent days. Malcolm MacLeod, his brother Alan, is one of the survivors, issued a statement on behalf of the family, who are based in Devon, which we voiced.
We are all very relieved that Alan is now safe. It's been a long, stressful 4 days for the family. Our dad is living in Thailand and he left his contact details with the British Embassy, BP and Orion, who Alan works for. And none of these fed any information, despite being told he would be the first to know. The lack of information from all the relevant sources was very poor. We were kept up to date from friends who worked in the oil and gas industry and the news. Our thoughts are now with the other families who were not so lucky as us.
Well, we did ask to speak to a government minister this lunchtime, but we were told no one was available. The drama and horror of the hostage-taking has focused attention on an area largely absent from international headlines. The Sahel is a horizontal strip of Africa lying below the Sahara Desert and north of the Sudan region. Algeria is to the north and northwest, with Libya to the northeast. Below them, Mauritania, Mali, Niger and Chad. It's not a roll call of stable countries. For the last 10 years, the United States at least has been aware of the danger. It helped to train African troops for counterinsurgency there, but at some point it opted to contain rather than confront the armed groups. That at least is according to Vicki Huddleston. Until last year, she was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for Africa, the most senior US defence official dealing with the continent. She served under President Obama, having been ambassador to Mali when George Bush was president. But as she's been telling me, getting Washington to wake up to the threat from Islamist groups in the Sahel was a frustrating experience.
I think in some ways this concern in Washington is, please don't put this in front of me. Africa is the lowest priority in our foreign policy. And putting boots on the ground after Black Hawk Down in Somalia is absolutely the last thing we want to do. So what we were content to do was train the local militaries because we realized that it was a problem.
You say that the last thing anyone wanted to do was put boots on the ground. Do you think that position needs to be revised?
Personally, I think it needs to be revised because I think we must be willing to put combat boots on the ground. These troops, these special forces, they don't have to go into combat, but they should be with the military of the local country so that they can mentor them so that they will be successful. I can assure you that had the French not stepped in and Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb, if they had taken over Mali, a country of 14 million, this would be as bad as Rwanda or Darfur.
You're talking about boots on the ground, special forces supporting the armies in the region. But what if they can't on their own effectively deal with these groups?
We can structure it two ways so that we can stay behind the lines or we can be there to rescue them if that is necessary. But I think what we need to look at right now is how do we structure this. The latest report I saw is that France was saying they wanted to lead. Bravo. because putting the Nigerians up there would be an absolute disaster if they were leading. The Nigerians should be welcome to be part of the force, but they don't know anything about desert warfare. So first of all, you have to have the right leader. France could do it. Algeria would be better, maybe a co-lead. The other part of the force is Mauritania, if they will join, Niger and Chad, because they actually have been fighting this al-Qaeda franchise for the last 5-6 years, and they know the desert and they know how to do it. Libya should become involved too, because if they get up into Libya, we have a real problem, because then you have more oil and gas facilities and more possibilities for hostages. It will just reoccur if they're pushed back into the desert. They have to be routed out. One half of this problem is the al-Qaeda franchises that have been operating in the Malian Sahara and reaching out throughout the area. The other half of the problem is the local rebel movement. The Tuaregs have been rebelling since Malian independence 60 years ago. There have to be negotiations with the Tuareg, the other northern nomadic groups. When I was in Mali, one time I asked this local chief if he had seen the al-Qaeda franchise, and he was sort of reluctant to say anything. And I said, well, you know, we have those eyes in the sky. And he looked at me and he said, well, we have been the masters of the desert for thousands of years, and you will never succeed here if you don't work with us.
More than 8 years ago, during the Pan-Sahel Initiative, one of these kind of two initiatives that the US government has had over the last decade, the New York Times reported that generals here say the vast arid region is a new Afghanistan with well-financed bands of Islamic militants. That's the middle of the last decade. I wonder what's gone wrong with the US response to this problem.
When we formed the Trans-Sahelian Counterterrorism Initiative in order to assist these African countries, we trained them and provided them with intelligence so that they would be able to confront and defeat the al-Qaeda groups in the north. That policy was changed subsequently to containing the al-Qaeda groups in the north. Well, containing extremists in an area of over 5,000 miles is absolutely impossible. It's a strategy that makes no sense whatsoever.
So the Obama administration got that wrong?
Yes, they did.
I wonder, though, whether intervention has actually in some ways proved to be counterproductive. We saw in Libya the Americans, the French, the British and others decided they would support the rebellion against Colonel Gaddafi and played their part in bringing an end to his regime. But that has it not, unintended consequences?
It has, but let's not forget that it was a successful humanitarian war. And yes, it did have enormous unintended consequences. The Tuareg troops that were integrated into Gaddafi's army then returned to Mali. So they were back, their weapons were back, but at the same time, thousands of weapons were flowing out of Libya, and AQIM was ready to take those weapons.
3 years ago, you told a Senate subcommittee that, to quote you, the long-term solution must be that each nation is capable of governing and controlling its territory. If not, you added, the extremists, even if temporarily deterred, will return to the ungoverned spaces. Are we any nearer achieving that objective in the Sahel region?
No, we're a lot further away because there's a lot more arms and a lot more extremist groups in the Sahel than when I was there.
Vicki Huddleston. Well, we brought together three people with a keen interest in this part of Africa. Sir Jeremy Greenstock, Britain's ambassador at the United Nations, formerly. After retiring, he was an advisor to BP. Henri Levi is a philosopher who helped to persuade Nicolas Sarkozy of the moral case for helping the rebels in Libya, and he's supporting French intervention in Mali now. As an academic, Mohamed Mohamedou has written an influential book about al-Qaeda, and he's also been foreign minister of Mauritania, one of the countries on the front line. He says these are old problems given a new urgency.
We have, of course, a number of developments over the past 2 years which are key, particularly the security vortex, the overflow out of Libya. Now, what seems to be particularly important here is the acceleration of all of these issues of the past couple of weeks. There was a bit of a plan last year with a regional leadership that was being prepared with all of the limitations and all of the lack of experience which is real with ECOWAS and the regional countries. Having said that, it seems to me that we were moving towards some sort of a locally customized, regionally customized version of intervention. But what happened since the early part of January is the acceleration with the French intervention, which admittedly is at the request of the Malian government. So there's no fundamental question about the legitimacy of it. Having said that, there are real questions about the doability of it.
Let me bring in Bernard Henri Levi there, because you took a very strong view on the need for France to take a moral leadership role in Libya and help persuade President Sarkozy to do just that. Do you feel the same about Mali, and do you think public opinion in France is willing to accept a longer-term commitment? For the moment, yes. I'm not sure it will last very long. You know, the public opinion in the age of democracy is very volatile. They change very soon. But the legitimacy is here. The necessity was there. I did not care about France taking the lead, but someone had to take the lead. To leave a terrorist state to settle in the core of Africa and at the doors of Europe was inconceivable. And I would like to add to what Mr. Mohamedou said, that for me the worst would have been, and has for long been, to say that Africa is out of the game, that what can happen in Africa is none of our business. There was this temptation in the 80s and the 90s, the idea of a cursed continent, which wars did not concern us at all. Today, the good news, if I dare say, that what happens in Africa is our business, that it is an international affair, that no one can wash his hands from the blood and the flesh and the suffering of the African people. This is a progress. So Jeremy Greenstock, we wanted to do something similar in Afghanistan, and gradually the public appetite for that has diminished to the point where every political leader involved is talking about getting their troops home. Indeed, some have already left. How do you think we avoid a similar response maybe months or years down the line in Africa? Because the Prime Minister was saying just this morning, this is a commitment that will take decades.
I agree that it's going to take a long time. You don't wipe these people out over a weekend. And this is actually becoming, in one sense, a global problem, or a global problem wherever violent jihadism in the Islamic world can take root, that anywhere where there may be ungoverned space will be attractive for these sorts of cells to set themselves up and try and launch operations from. The Sahara is a big empty space. Lots of places may be able to hide these sorts of cells, and what we're talking about on a global basis is establishing the rule of law so that these people can't operate freely in the way that they're trained up now and motivated to do. And I suppose, Dr. Mohamedou, the difficulty is that establishing legitimate governments and letting them flourish so that the rule of law is there is a longer-term ambition and objective. When you've got an immediate concern over security, as we saw with the hostage-taking, that tends to take second place.
That's the central question. That's the whole idea of reconciling long-lasting state-building objectives with immediate security concerns, as well as bridging the international dimension that was just mentioned with the regional one. But let me, if I may, go back slightly to this notion of the we and the them. The real problem, fundamentally, is not this war against terrorism in the singular, which frankly does not make much sense. The original problem in Mali is the political crisis. To that we have, as we mentioned, the invasion, in fact, of these Algerian-bred groups that come, the unresolved Tuareg issue since the 60s, and now, as we mentioned, the Libyan overflow. So in the immediate, the plan, the UN plan, as discussed at the Security Council as late as December 20th, had to do essentially with this dimension. And the French intervened essentially within that context. They reminded themselves of that just a few hours ago. But the bottom line is that we have now increasingly an outlook on this as if it was solely against this notion of terrorism. For sure, the presence of a terrorist sanctuary as it has developed in northern Mali for the past couple of years undeniably is an issue. But if we are to move towards precisely what you were indicating, the state-building challenges, the lasting, complex, unresolved set of issues which are development-oriented, then surely we should not escape the immediacy of that.
Bernard-Henri Levi, I suppose that's one of the chastening consequences of the decision to intervene in Libya. Out goes the Gaddafi regime, but unfortunately with it goes some of the stability.
I don't accept the theory of Mali being the consequence of liberation of Libya and fight against Gaddafi. First of all, the weapons of the Islamist groups in northern Mali do not come from the revolutionary in Libya, but come from the Gaddafi stocks. Number two, there is this idea of the dictator being a shield against terrorism and against Islamism, which is the reverse. Terror, despotism, tyranny produces, feeds Islamism and so on. And number three, what happened today in northern Mali? Number one, old problem. Since years and years, the Tuareg, as Mr. Mohamed just said. And number two, the decision made by this very big international of terror to move in this area. It is not the question of consequence of Libya and so on, and saying that it was better time under Gaddafi than today. This is really, for me, the worst analysis of the situation and the worst way to go through the problems which arise.
Dr. Mohamedou, do you want to come back briefly on that?
Yes, one thing we can agree on is that there's no having any nostalgia about the Gaddafi days. This was authoritarianism at its worst, and it had to go fundamentally. However, as early as last year, we see AQIM itself going precisely indeed to loot the Gaddafi stockpiles and bring back weapons which probably were used in the past couple of weeks. I think the issue here is not so much to go back and revisit the need for Gaddafi to go. There is consensus on that. I think it's having the honesty to recognize the fact that the Libyan vortex that has been born over the past couple of months is clearly having an impact on what took place on Mali. What I will agree to is that it's only one of several components, and I would certainly blame more the original Algerian overflow of the late 90s and early 2000s with the Salafist Group for Eradication and Combat literally taking parts of that territory.
So, Jeremy, now that the Algerians are clearly engaged and they acted very, very swiftly in this hostage-taking crisis, possibly because they were concerned about how some of the big energy companies on whom their economy is dependent might respond if this kind of thing started to take hold. Do you think there is within the region a momentum that the international powers are going to be willing to support?
The vociferousness of international politics, the polarisation of cultures and religion across international boundaries is a complicating factor in all of this. A uniting factor is the need for every government to have control of its own territory. And I think the momentum for that second factor will be greater because of this recent operation.
About Algeria, one must remember first of all that Algeria was the last in the area to support Gaddafi. Has to remember also that Algeria has played games for a long time with terrorism. We have to remember also that they have a vested interest, a political vested interest in the Tuareg question. Nevertheless, today, for the reasons which have been said, they are on board. This is good news, but I would not be happy to see them taking any sort of leadership in the operations. And if you regard the way they dealt with the hostage crisis, the Putin way, the Russian way, if I dare say, the Putin method which they used, it makes you freak out and it frightens. They did it in such a brutal way.
And what about you, Dr. Mohamedou? You have this moment, this brief, perhaps, window of opportunity where public opinion says something must be done. How do you seize this moment and what do you want from it?
What seems to matter to me in the next phase is linking the current French operation with the pre-existing track, which was the regional cum international one.
One final question to Sir Jeremy, a domestic question. At what point and in what form does Britain intervene?
Well, I think we will be talking with the French already in great detail about this. There might even be NATO discussions on how we help to create a rule of law in a new area for NATO. We are serious security players internationally. I'm sure we're going to be deeply involved, but there will be resource questions, there will be questions of public support for yet another intervention. The Prime Minister is going to have to weigh this, but we must be involved in an international effort to make sure that the opportunities for these sorts of jihadist cells are limited to an absolute minimum.
Jeremy Greenstock, Mohamed Mohamedou and Benar Henri Levi. Well, I've just been watching some live pictures from Washington where Joe Biden has been sworn in the last few minutes as Vice President. Today is the start of Barack Obama's second term. Al-Qaeda and associated groups in Africa is now one of the problems he'll have to address perhaps differently than from his first term. Our Washington correspondent Johnny Diamond has been reflecting on what else might change.
It is cold and clear and crisp in Washington right now. Startling blue skies and winds that cut through the thickest coats, much as it was 4 years ago, when a man with the rather unlikely name of Barack Hussein Obama was sworn in as the 44th President of the United States. Something in the region of 1.5 million people gathered in the freezing cold that day to watch him take the oath of office. Fewer will come on Monday. But still, the crowds will ripple out over the Mall, that strip of columns and flags, of marble and green ceremonial that is the heart of this city. It's tempting to say that that's where the similarities end. The last 4 years have drawn on Barack Obama. Often he has appeared wearied by the burdens of office, bewildered by the intransigence of his foes, bereft of the soaring inspiration that lifted him to giddy victory 4 years ago. He came to office, in his own words, amidst gathering clouds and raging storms. American troops fighting and dying in 2 faraway wars, an economy hurtling downhill, that great symbol of American industrial might, the car industry, on its knees and begging for help. And he came to office, yes, amidst a surge of hope, but also against the background of a bitterly divided polity, where each side cast the other as the nation's enemy, and where compromise and consensus, vital to the American system of government, had been cast aside. This day, he said then, we come to proclaim an end to the recriminations that have for too long strangled our politics. We remain a young nation, but the time has come to set aside childish things. Bliss it was in that dawn to be alive. As one of the president's opponents commented as America's economic woes continued, how's all that hopey, changey stuff working out for you? It has been a rocky economic road that the president has travelled. Unemployment is still uncomfortably high and growth anemic. One war is over, the violence and instability left behind ignored by a country weary of foreign entanglements. Another war is winding down. An historic healthcare reform has been put in place, and spurred by astonishing deposits of oil and natural gas, America's economy may be about to take off again. The country's problems are legion, but its energy and opportunities are astonishing to witness. One great challenge for Barack Obama has been overcome. He was re-elected. No one-term wonder he. Now he must avoid the graveyard of presidencies, the second term. Clinton, Reagan and Bush all found themselves dragged down by scandal, stymied by the knowledge that this was the end of their political lives. Time is surprisingly short for a man with a 4-year term ahead of him. And still Washington wonders about the man himself. Quite what Barack Obama stands for is still something of a mystery. Perhaps it was in search of consensus that he resisted laying out a narrative. Perhaps he once thought his legacy would be to bring a politically divided nation together. That is not to be. Perhaps then that is what the second term will bring, starting tomorrow in the Mall, the unfurling of his colours in the hard sunshine of a cold January day.
Johnny Diamond, and President Obama takes the oath in just over 3 hours' time. A reminder of the main story this lunchtime. 6 Britons are now thought to have died in the Algerian hostage-taking, along with a Colombian man who lived in this country. The former US ambassador to Mali told us the Obama administration changed policy from confrontation to containment and must now change course again, deploying special forces to help African governments regain control. Now, through the window behind me here in central London, I can still see the snow falling steadily. John Hammond at the BBC Weather Centre can tell us what to expect elsewhere.
Thanks very much, Sean. Yes, it is snowing across the London area. Much of the southeast and East Anglia has had a snowy morning, and we're getting around about 2 to 5 centimetres accumulating within this zone, and it's arrowing across the Midlands up in the direction of northeast Wales and the Cheshire area as well. Now, this broad band of snow will continue to progress its way further northwards through the rest of the day, setting in across much of northern England through this evening, and then onwards up into Scotland. It could get particularly nasty up over the high ground, where locally we could see as much as 10 to 15 centimetres of snow up over the high ground in northern England and eastern Scotland. Amber warnings have been issued by the Met Office. We could well see blizzard conditions as the winds continue to freshen. Could well be rain or sleet, though, just along the coastal fringe. Behind that, the weather clears up across southern areas. So through this evening and overnight, we could see a severe frost if those skies clear for any length of time, with temperatures potentially as low as -10. The prospect for much of the rest of the week is for the cold weather to continue. Expect further severe frosts and, yes, the ongoing prospect of some snow. Sean.
John Hammond, thank you very much for that. Our studio director today was Ruth Stewart, producer Mark Faulkner, the editor Manveen Rana. And that's the world this weekend.
Catherine Whitehorn will be giving her thoughts on the quarter-life crisis facing many 20-somethings in a minute. That's after Simon Parkes has given us a taste of his pick of the week.
Big themes this week: enduring friendship, rivalry, feuds, jealousy and tunnels. And fitting somewhere in between, there's Benjamin Zephaniah's view of Winnie the Pooh and how a bottle of pungent mustard sauce made the journey all the way from Calcutta in India to a remote Hampshire rectory and in the 18th